Artist Space Books and Talks. Thank you for coming along this afternoon and for joining us for this event. Today is the final event in a weekend of presentations that form part of Artist Space's curatorial programming partnership with WHITNEY Biennial 2012. This weekend has been brought together under the title MaterialsMoneyCrisis and has developed through discussions with biennial artist Sam Lewitt around the relationship between the materials of art production and the media of financialization. This afternoon's presentation stems from an invitation to Michael Sanchez to speak in relation to his recent writing on an image ecology of art as mediated by the web and how artworks perform within online social and economic networks. We're very pleased that he has collaborated with Jeff Nagy on a paper that focuses on Jutta Koerter's contribution to the WHITNEY Biennial, considering the work in relation to the operations of global finance. So to give you some brief further biographical background on Jeff and Michael, Jeff Nagy studied at Harvard College and the Iowa Writers' Workshop. With Eric Linsker, he co-edits the Claudius app, an online journal of negative reviews and poems. His poems and essays have appeared in publications including Vault, High Zero, Drunken Boat, Bomb Blog, and Art Forum. Michael Sanchez holds degrees from Harvard College and Columbia University, where he's currently a PhD candidate in art history. His criticism has appeared in Text zur Kunst and Art Forum, as well as the anthology Art and Subjecthood, The Return of the Figure in Semi-Capitalism. So I'll pass over directly to Michael and Jeff. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So the talk that we're going to be giving today is actually a sort of a draft of a ooh, this is very hot mic. It's a draft of a text that will actually take into account eventually sort of three simultaneous exhibitions that Koerter is working on right now, which is sort of nested inside the other. So there's the WHITNEY Biennial, of course, which most of you have seen, I assume, opening very soon. There's also Bortolami exhibition, also of the seasons, and then for 4 or 5 days this coming weekend, there'll be more seasons on view at the Frieze Art Fair. So this is sort of focusing on the WHITNEY work, but also touching a little bit on the fifth season, to be continued. 3 days from now, Jutta Koerter's exhibition, The Fifth Season, will open at Bortolami Gallery in Chelsea. The fifth season refers to Carnival season in Cologne, which opens officially on 11:11 a.m. on November 11th, and to the title of a text by Kurt Tucholsky on the fifth season, which he describes as a liminal season between late summer and the beginning of fall. Overlapping from May 2nd to 27th with her installation of The Seasons at the WHITNEY Biennial, the fifth season, arriving in our unseasonably warm and unusually volatile spring into summer, will be a remake or refresh of her installation uptown of 4 paintings after Poussin's The Seasons. In the WHITNEY, the seasons are hung on vertical glass panes in a semicircular arrangement, with winter greeting the viewer. Koerter heightens the painting's interpolative function by the use of the back-turned Rückenfigur, in this case a Meissen white porcelain tigress, a vessel for both psychological and financial investment, which recently sold at auction for over €1 million. Spring, autumn, and summer are arranged out of sequence on the other side, facing one of the museum's trapezoidal windows. This arrangement is loosely based on the way that Poussin's originals are hung in their own rotunda in the Louvre, except that, as we'll see, Koerter twists the circle into a more complex topological figure. Before considering the seasons in any more detail, however, it's helpful to go back to one of her recent solo exhibitions, Berliner Schlüssel, or Berlin Key, at Gallery Daniel Buchholz in Berlin. With Koerter's work, one must always consider the circulation of paintings, since their significance is most often differential, appearing in the interstice or cut. In particular, we can turn to one series of works from this show, Berliner Schlüssel 9, 10, and 11, which is based on a fresco from the Roman city of Bosco Real, housed at the Metropolitan Museum of Art.
These 3 paintings, hung in Berlin on an artificial wall, depict a wall fresco across which a garland oscillates. Originally woven out of attributes of autumn, Koerter turns this garland into a support structure from which recurrent motifs in her work are hung: an overflowing mussel pot, taken from Marcel Brother's, an emoticon-like mask, and so on. Undulating in a periodic structure across all three canvases, predictable and continuous like a sine curve or a rondo, the garland is interrupted by two arbitrary or irrational cuts, transforming the fresco into painting by the foot. Although these paintings are periodized in an artificial way, the garlands provided a visual syntax on which they could drape themselves into cohesive syntagm, each a metonymic instance in a larger unity. The eye in Berlin could follow the garlands as if a key, as if a Berliner key, in one side and out the other. Koetter inverts this operation in the seasons. Here, the surface of the paintings is strewn with exploded garlands onto or through which financial indexes are stamped. Koetter has said that the indexes here depicted are derived from the actual market fluctuations as recorded across the target season, drawn from publications such as the Financial Times, etc., with the caveat, however, that they fail to reproduce the full range of available data for the period, leaving lacunae between the end of one and the beginning of the next, blocks of financialized time that transpire behind closed doors. In this new context, it is the line that becomes arbitrary, the stochastic random walk modeled on Brownian motion of minute market movements, and the cut that becomes periodic, referring to the notional and reiterable separation of one season from the next. The illusionistic wall the frescoes represent, or even the very real one on which they hung side by side, and the garlands that articulated them as a unit are here removed, replaced supposedly by a system of cyclical, symbolic, and cultural metonymy, that of seasons.
But a cycle invoked in the context of a new seasonality, one predicated not upon planetary motion, but on market architectures that make continuous production not only possible but de rigueur. In her notes that accompany the seasons, Koetter has compared its seasonal structure with the temporality of television and fashion. But in television, shifting as it is to the on-demand model, the seasonality of programming linked to broadcast is eroding. Already, Hulu and Netflix have their own original programming. The same is true, for example, of book printing. And even in fashion, still the most season-driven of all the industries, developments such as fast fashion have introduced micro-seasonalities into the production cycle, in which new items are delivered every few weeks and a new season constituted every couple of months. From the pause that refreshes, an ad campaign for Coke introduced just in time for the market collapse of 1929, is now derived a refreshment without pause, in which the seasons are pixelated with an increasing resolution. As they flatten out over time, or in fact simply flatten time itself, they also demand, for those who would aim to exploit them, an enhanced degree of granularity. The quick, increasingly computerized eye on the index that catches the split-second information disparity between currency markets and makes the advantageous trade. The setup of the canvases at the Whitney, of course, also resembles a multi-screen viewing terminal, a trading pit, or, as the canvases are hung on thick architectural glass walls, a bank lobby. In the seasons, just as the scenes bleed out beyond each of their painted frames and corners, the new reality of a homogeneous and financialized time both bleeds motifs across the canvases, whereby they cease to be properly seasonal, and internally reduplicates them in mise en abîme of seasonal subdivision. A tree at the far left of Summer, in which Poussin's treatment of Ruth and Boaz is reimagined as a Godzilla-like portrait of Formula One champion Sebastian Vettel, reappears in roughly the same position in Autumn, an inset close-up of Poussin's spies, here rendered acephalic, returning with grapes from the Holy Land. The tree is just as laden with fruit as it has been a season before. Hyper-inflated and breast-like fruit in spring and autumn stipple the canvases with shallow saliences, matched by the flat depth of the whirlpools and exploded garlands. The especially effervescent garlands of spring, in which an Edenic cutter uses apples from the tree of knowledge as visual prostheses to steer a young atom, returns in winter, blackened and almost absorbing the index, now also black. Again in winter, where the porcelain tigress bears witness to a brackish exhaust that fills the canvas, one of autumn's two spies reappears distorted, as if it had bled through the glass wall that separates the two seasons, barely still recognizable as a human figure.
The garland uniting the Berlin canvases dissolves in the seasons in favor of these trans-seasonal motifs and the omnipresent indexes in which they're trapped. But their ends from one season to the next, as we've said, fail to line up. so that the eye that would follow them across, looking for exploitable trends, is thwarted, forced instead to subdivide each season individually, to pixelate it. A hair splitting figured in the paintings themselves, in the whirlpool-like swirls that dot their surfaces. These swirls act as figures for the kind of hermeneutic whirlpool that current conditions make mandatory, in which markets, marked by a fractal volatility isomorphic at all levels of resolution, are scrutinized with increasing granularity for increasingly small returns. As the eye circulates across the seasons, where winter is the visible-invisible introduction and denouement with microscopic scrutiny, it collects these trans-seasonal motifs as its depleted harvest. The financial index is a way of commoditizing information, both in the sense of monetizing it and in the sense of reducing its particularity to a price point. Its new common medium, the line ticked up and down on the stock chart, facilitates the isolation of periods or products of particular interest. One can now take cuts of information where, in the Berlin frescoes, one took cuts of canvas. In front of the seasons, the eye in its interpretive eddy exercises a similar kind of cutting and batching, but against a helical progression that would maintain the seasons in their specificity. The eye cuts out its objects from the canvas, batching motifs without respect to their supposedly original season.
But the roving, batching eye is also bruised, with the grapes of autumn popping out of the surface of the canvas like spots on the surface of the eye after it's hit with a blunt instrument. And the eye that follows the black line of the index in winter, through its entanglements with the withered ash garlands and whirlpools, is itself blacked by an onslaught of incoherent strokes. As the assaulted eye rediscovers reprise of motifs in the interior seasons, it recapitulates a bruising of seasonality itself, a sludging of it into one blurred sameness, a polluted painting, Kötter writes of winter. One is reminded of Kötter's 2008 series of landscapes exhibited at the Van Abbe Museum in 2009, alongside her earlier Poussin appropriation, Hot Rod. The landscapes were described by the artist as bruised Cézannes. Like these earlier bruised canvases, where paint-by-number still lives bled into landscapes, the motifs can enact an internal bleeding within a single canvas, most notably in autumn. Autumn has a recursive feature. Under the pair of acephalic spies carrying back grapes from the Holy Land in the painting's most assertive foreground are another, smaller pair facing the opposite direction, presumably carrying the grapes right back in. Another inverted autumn nests inside the first, as a fifth season preparing the way for its own return in the fifth season. A recursion in a painting that Kötter describes as post-medium, as one of, quote, painting being transported outside of itself, unquote, which also cleverly naturalizes the formal index. Through the recursion, the index is legible as landscape, as background instead of background noise, recoding a second-order effect as a first-order mimesis.
If painting, like the grapes from the Holy Land, is being transported outside of itself, it's also, like the grapes, being transported back in, via transfusions from Kötter's own previous work as well as the work of others. The above-mentioned circulation of painting in which the paintings are involved comes, in the transfusion subject as artist, to constitute the paintings themselves. Motifs from Kötter's earlier work constantly recirculate and appear in the seasons, including, for instance, the circular orbs that manifest as a mask in the Berlin frescoes, and earlier as the site for the emergence of a stereotyped affect. See, for example, Unvollendete Sympathie from 2002. And that here appear as almost obscenely nomadic fruit. Transfusions of already capitalized references can also be effected from donor paintings outside her oeuvre, as in her repeated deployment of the Brodler's muscle pot, affixed to the canvas like a sticker, simultaneously branding and pricing it. If the Berlin paintings, also transfusion works, dissected a patently coherent body of painting into arbitrarily sized slices, the garland's continuation across the boundaries of each canvas guaranteed the possibility of that body's resutured wholeness, simultaneously stringing together the transfused material into the fresco's progression. In the seasons, however, the situation is quite otherwise, not only in relation to the indexes that neither meet each other nor support motifs, nor only in relation to the flush corners, quote unquote, as Kötter refers to the L brackets she frequently paints on the corners of paintings, which are, you should be able to see them. They're not so visible on the screen, but you can kind of see them in each corner of the canvases. These flush corners hold each painting open internally while also separating it from its fellows. Here, the contributions of her donors, so it seems, are always in season, as their citation and her own self-reference keep the paintings from healing into self-sufficiency, a condition that one of her most frequently deployed motifs encodes. The garlands in the Berlin frescoes, themselves a figure for the network and for connectivity, are only the latest iteration in a series of displacements on the function of the line that goes back to her early work, from stitch, Michael, to chain, to lightning, each with its own relation to an underlying principle of cleavage or suture. In Berlin, the lightning was captured or reterritorialized into the circuit of its surrounding architectural elements, there like a bound cathexis or a healed scar. Here, the garland has been superseded by the index, which metaphorically acts as the avatar for her typical bundling of nerves or asparagus, while also being a 90-degree rotation of the previous instances of the vertical lightning in the Berlin frescoes. The index thereby functions as a transcendental motif, as the motif that can encode in a single line all of the other motifs related to line included, while also encoding one form of their history, their fluctuation in value across a temporal axis.
As against this backbleed of motifs throughout Kötter's catalog, indexed by the indexes, repeated series of monochromes, typically in black or red, recur throughout her career. While so many parameters of her work are variable in the extreme, the monochromatic interruptions are constant, irrecuperable into the season's fashions, a counter-cyclical tendency that peaks at times in bruise-like canvases, blunt bleeds of color overlaid with slicks of liquid glass. Countercyclicality is, of course, a financial term, referring to a quantity that tends to move in inverse relationship to the financial markets. For example, the movements of gold on the commodities market after the end of the gold standard and the birth of a postmodern, referent-free finance of floated gold and floating exchange rates have been countercyclical, a trend played out in its most recent dramatic upswing in the aftermath of the credit crisis. These series act as cuts in any pro-cyclical critical narrative that, as Isabella Graf has argued, would suture her career into a continuous progression of aesthetic value. They operate as a transperiodic retractor, but also as a refrain, like the backflow of blood in cardiac systole. Kötter's recidivism with respect to these series, the tendency of her work in this regard to a willful regression, to double back on itself, blurring the stages of the career together, enacts on a temporally extended scale the bruising of seasonality in the Whitney seasons. In the localized internal bleeding commonly called a bruise, the breakage of capillaries releases blood from its predetermined circulation through the body, allowing it to pool visibly under the skin. Like capital, like blood, a networked painting must circulate in order to perform its function of accretion and expenditure. But Kötter's monochromes, frequently under their transparent liquid glass membranes, affect a counter-cyclical bleed, cooling down her career's inflation, hoarding a value that, in its sheer repetitiousness, asserts its distance from the market and its fluctuations, a value that, in the absence or even in resistance to circulation, appears to begin more properly as waste.
Not only has the Kötter market developed alongside the crisis, the rise of metallic paint in her work, visible especially in autumn, can be linked to the rises in the metals markets, another form whereby Kötter's paintings index the market movements. The seasons shine with metallic paint, gold, silver, and blue, in much higher concentrations than usual in her work, a trend which, echoing the recent downturn in precious metals, will reverse itself in the fifth season. Turning again to autumn, and its invocations both of the market and of the critical reception of her work in painting beside itself, it is not only painting but David Josselit's text which is harvested and taken to market, two levels of iconography whose concatenation calls attention to the market function of criticism, which has been even more obvious in this case than usual. Like the price of gold, citations to Josselit's text have dramatically risen since the financial crisis, creating a viral network of reference which, in an instance of bizarre recursivity, enacts the very hypothesis of the text. The multiplication of this referential network, in which the reference is good as gold, is inseparable from the growth of the market for networked paintings. Josselit has persuasively argued that Kötter's paintings, quote, suture a virtual world of images onto an actual network composed of human actors, unquote. But, as we've tried to demonstrate, Kötter is also interested in what she herself, in an interview from the Stockholm exhibition catalog, has described as, quote, a subject that is truly open, that must always be constituted afresh. What we find with Koete is the negative of the neoliberal Deleuzian subject that rose to prominence in the 1990s and 2000s alongside relational aesthetics. A polymorphously productive subject, defined through multiple interfaces and activated in multiple assemblages, returns here as a wounded subject, a dark Deleuzian subject whose openness must be repeatedly cut or wrenched.
As we've seen, one function of the flesh corners is as surgical retractors that hold open an incision. What enters this incision or wound in the subject and the painting are flows. The cut renders the subject open to contingencies, perhaps best exemplified by the weather. Think of the turbulent swirls of black air circulating through winter, or the metallic heat of summer, or the atmospheric scar tissue-like airiness of the Berlin faux frescoes. These flows can also be flows of information. Consider the enormous breadth of references which her work processes, in which the timely or trendy, for example, synchronizing references to Francesca Woodman in the fifth season with her retrospective at the MoMA, or channeling the theoretical trends of the season, as in her use of Latour in Berliner Schlüssel, is mixed with the untimely and asynchronous, such as Francis Bacon and Bosco Real. Now, in the seasons, Koete opens the paintings to flows of finance capital in such a way that stimulation in the sense of an economic stimulus package is blurred with stimulus as an affective jolt. See her drawing of an efflorescence of bills held open by 4 flesh corners reproduced in the Whitney catalog, entitled Wurzel der Erregung, or Root of the Stimulus. The market indexes, of course, also resemble the spikes and waves of electrical discharge recorded in an EEG. Quote, a subject that is truly open and must always be constituted afresh, writes Koete. Such a constantly refreshed temporality, central to the seasons, is reminiscent not only of early video art with its subject maintained in a post-historical presentness through refresh rates and feedback loops, but also of, more proximate to us now, theorizations of what Paulo Verno has called the virtuosic subject of post-Fordism. As many theorists of the knowledge economy have pointed out, labor occurs primarily now in a project-based time frame in which flexibility is demanded in the cognitive skill set of the subject and her ability to interface with others. The man for all seasons becomes the man for all networks. If Koeter's paintings are models of networked subjectivity, they enact this dispersion across their very surface. As Koete herself writes, quote, the picture itself now seems to take up these impulses and to say, for instance, I want to be metallic now I have to be very fragile, I must be crumpled now I have to do this and that, unquote. Network labor has a temporality of its own, tending to replace the seasonal or even diurnal schedules of work with an on-demand model and a turn to the extreme short term, to instantaneous turnarounds.
Turnarounds in a double sense. Within such a transitional or transitive model of the subject, one refreshes oneself by turning incessant about faces. Koete has emblematized this condition in the Berlin exhibition, in which we find an installation of 2 paintings, one of which is a self-portrait after a Poussin self-portrait, placed back-to-back in between 2 panels of a sliding door, like the obverse and the reverse of a coin, or as a reference to Janus, the two-faced god of doors and transitions. In the seasons, although this formal operation is repeated in the sandwiching of winter and autumn around a pane of glass, the avatar of the speedy subject here materializes in summer's Sebastian Vettel. Painting as car. The coinage comes from Leo Steinberg, who in the late 1960s compared successive seasons of late modernist paintings with new models of cars turned out by Detroit. The seasonality of trends is, of course, also one of the presuppositions of the biennial, which proliferated at precisely the same time that Steinberg describes. But today, with microtrends generated and transmitted erratically through blogs and feeds, can the bi-yearly structure of the biennial keep pace or account for the specificity of the patterns whereby trends are virally transmitted? The formal topology of networks understood as the message of the messages passed through them. Is the archaicizing costume under which seasonality is brought back, which incorporates a reflection on the structure of the biennial itself, with 8 Koeter seasons on view in New York corresponding to the 8 seasons which separate one biennial from the next. Is this costume, then, a signal of the biennial itself's impending obsolescence?
Koeter writes in her notes accompanying the seasons that the work could have been entitled The Seasons: Crises. For Koeter, each of the internal seasons links up with a recent political crisis, or what she lists as, quote, upset revolutions, fake revolutions, Arab Spring, Greek Summer, NY Fall, OWS. The 4th crisis in her list, a crisis perhaps more essential in its closer relation to the medium that subtends them all, is Euro crisis, diagnosed as ongoing, a crisis that seems to align then with winter, a canvas depicting a crisis that can't be envisioned from within the system, the trading floor surrounded by 3 inward-facing seasons. These 3 seasons, the Arab Spring, the Greek Summer, and the Occupy Fall, are thus epiphenomena, in fact governed by the underlying economic base, whose index and the interpretive act operated on it that generates the next are represented invisibly elsewhere. As she says, quote, interpretation is the crucial act that then generates the next index, unquote. The diagonal line that cleaves winter, a straightening of the lightning bolt in Poussin's original, or this lightning bolt viewed in extreme close-up or from extreme distance, signals permanent downturn. When we were in the spring, summer, autumn loop, the loop in which the market dreams the dream of its own timelessness, as Joseph Fogel puts it in his recent article, Taming Time, Media Financialization, winter's permanent downturn and permanent cleavage are unviewable.
In terms of the installation of the works, winter is what opens or invaginates this loop. The becoming media of finance discussed by Vogel structures its particular temporality via a relationship between the loop, the line, and the cut. The development of the derivatives market in Vogel's account necessitated a taming or mastery of time in which temporal contingency is overcome by converting future presents into present futures. The virulent financialization of the mid-1970s, propelled by the development of the Black-Scholes equation for pricing derivatives, marks the mutation of the financial system into a media system. Those of you who were here yesterday heard Benjamin Lee give a pretty interesting presentation about that period, especially in reference to like the anthropology of finance. The market, then becoming media at this period in time in the 1970s and early 1980s, synthesizes a linear temporality out of temporal looping based on comparing slices of past volatility with their corresponding forecasted futures. This is going back to the Joseph Vogel quote we already introduced. Under the conditions of media, the market dreams the dream of its timelessness. The neutralization of risk works only if each pending future can be continued by one more future. On the other hand, this detemporalizing is assured only through the use of time-critical processes, end quote, where Vogel is referring to things like deadlines and contract dates, things that stress the continuation of the system but on which it depends for its reproduction of value. If the Louvre Rotunda in which Poussin's originals are displayed is a figure for the endless loop of the eternal return, a homogenized financial time that rationally and imperturbably recurs, the structure of the Whitney installation involutes this loop into a Mobius strip. The way in which the installation involutes the space of the Louvre Rotunda is perhaps already quite patent. Winter disrupts the self-sufficient interiority of the loop by being positioned on its obverse. In the interior canvases, all of the represented figures appear facing out, addressing themselves to the space in the interior of the loop, whereas in winter, the outward-facing canvas, the figure that there appears, the Meissen cat, faces inward. Of the 4 seasons, winter includes the most prominent internal painted frame, a recessed canvas into which the cat fixedly gazes, as if it could look through it into the interior space from which the other 3 canvases would be visible. Or look even further, out through the trapezoidal window that serves as the installation's 4th wall, out into the reel itself. This twisting of inside-outside is visible even from inside what remains of the loop. A transversal bar cuts laterally across the canvas as if a tracing of the stretcher bar in all of the seasons, but in autumn most visibly, where it serves double duty as the bar on which the Holy Land's stolen grapes are hung. If one pays attention to this bar, each painting becomes a miniature Mobius strip, with its reverse visible on its surface, so that the larger involuted structure of space is repeated in each individual painting.
As Koche's installation involutes space, it also involutes time, presenting a time-critical critique of the time-critical processes discussed by Vogel, financial systems that fashion their temporalities from loops, but that obscure that self-fashioning in order to self-present as linear. As with the involution of space, winter is the hinge for a temporal involution accomplished in 2 ways. Coming from the elevator, the viewer enters the group of paintings one of 2 directions, each of which leads to a different sequence. Either to the right of winter, in which case one sees summer next, followed by autumn and spring, or to the left, generating a spring, autumn, summer sequence. Regardless of her choice, after reaching the interior, the viewer then turns around to face all three paintings, back to the window, diagramming the temporal flow of viewing in the form of the Mobius strip as she leaves, in and out. The involution of the seasons, accomplished by winter's displacement, ties the second temporal knot, as winter's removal from the interior montage allows the window, where it would have presumably have hung, to remain uncovered. Its displacement allows you to look through it from the interior floor, so that one may look out into the real world, into real time, marked by the weather's contingencies. Winter is what blocks the exterior pane of glass on which it hangs from being visible, but its appearance there, as opposed to in its proper place in the cycle of seasons, leaves revealed another pane of glass through which all of the daily, hourly, and even seasonal fluctuations of the weather might be witnessed.
The viewer, turned away from the seasons to scrutinize the weather, sees there the immediate forecast of her own present future, a present future that, turning then to leave, begins its gradual conversion into a future present, whose deadline is crossed at the Whitney's front doors. Leaving the interior space, the viewer cannot look back the way one can at the Poussin, the Louvre Rotunda. One finds oneself instead confronted again with winter, whose effect is almost anamorphic, as the death's head hidden in the middle foreground of Holbein's Ambassadors reveals itself to an over-the-shoulder, parting glance. As Cutter's description of winter in her notes concludes, quote, "Therefore, looking at the real without synthesis," unquote. One sees not the real of the world outside the window, but the figure for looking at it, looking back at the image of an act of looking back, in the danger signal red mice and cat whose retrospection, like that of Lot's wife, has petrified it. Looking at the crisis, at the actual real, is actually petrifying. You don't synthesize it synthesizes you.
In the becoming media of financialization, a positive feedback loop in which derivatives are used to hedge present volatility via bets on future volatility, in turn based on past volatility, emerges. According to Fogel, this positive feedback loop endemic to the functioning of the financial system leads to periodic and accelerating crises, so 87, 1990, 94, 98, 2000, 2008, and so on, during which the medial structure of the system becomes apparent, with historical time once again surging forth out of tamed or timeless time. The taming of time invoked earlier is therefore never complete, as, quote, "the epoche of the financial economy," writes Fogel, "is the crisis, that is, it is the return of specific historical time periods within the system," unquote. In Koter's account of the crises behind the seasons, Arab Spring, Greek Summer, and OWS are the names taken by Vogel's, quote, "specific historical time periods." Registering these near-contemporary crises, Koter's paintings are historical, but in the sense of an infrahistorical painting. In Walter Benjamin's reading of David, painting makes a Tigersprung back into ancient Roman history in order to find a decor adequate to the revolution, mining past crises in order to suture possible future presents. Around the time of the French Revolution, history emerges as a proper object of study at the precise moment that a new time, or what Reinhard Koselleck calls a Neuzeit, gradually gives way to a Neueste Zeit, the latest time. Now, the historical time available to a painting that would be historical takes the form of an infinitely quick gap of the historical time that emerges out of timeless financial time.
For Koter, the tiger's leap spans the present and precisely this gap. The height of Arab Spring and now, for example, a radically shortened window of lapsed time, or even an ongoing one, as in her reference to the Euro crisis. Her painting is inframinimal, infrahistorical, not only in the sense of referring to periods close enough together that a blink could contain them, but also in the sense that the paintings refer not to two periods, or even to two events, but to a present and a gap which itself already implies a difference between the edges of a non-historical time that it holds open. In her notes, Koter writes, referring to the mice and tigress, quote, "The attentive creature will know what to do." What to do? For David, what to do meant using the Tigersprung as a suturing procedure, whereas for Koter, the white tigress should refuse precisely the synthesis of the real. To do nothing, to be porcelain, to glow, but to do nothing in a way that obstructs the closure of the gap. Watching then not for the advantageous trade opportunity, but for crisis, what to do is to seize the temporal gap that then there opens and to wedge painting inside it, retracting it. Inside the gap, retracted by a season of painting, a painted season emerges. a fifth season, or Goethe's the fifth season, which occupies a gap between two seasons, between summer and fall, the tamed and recurrent crisis of carnival season in Cologne. The paintings in the fifth season will be comic or autosatirical remakes of the works of the Whitney, but slightly shortened in their format, as if trimmed. Each season, therefore, being shorter, will look longer, just as red gravel placed on the floor of the gallery will decelerate the exhibition's viewers, lengthening their viewing time and introducing friction into their circulation. The attempt to extend is the same action as trying to retract the gap, is the same action as looking longer. Even the repetitiveness of the fifth season is a further attempt at extension, like an instantaneous or an infrahistorical revival, a season finale that, retrospectively montaging scenes from the season's preceding episodes, prospectively includes, in its montage, itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael and Jeff. Were you willing to take questions?
Sure.
Can we say no?
Okay.
We can't say no.
Yeah, we have to leave then. Does anybody have any questions to ask Michael or Jeff? Amy.
Amy does.
Maybe does.
I was wondering, like, what is, or if you could talk about the strategy for how the information content of the paintings, which isn't so like apparent in an immediate reading of the paintings, like how that gets transmitted.
Sure, yeah. It's not like, for instance, the films of Melanie Gilligan that we saw yesterday, where there's a very kind of patent information content that's being delivered almost didactically to a viewer to be made use of in daily life. That's not really the way that the indexes here function. But I think it does, it's sort of delivered, I mean, between paintings or across them in their sort of like differential function. I mean, do you want to say here something about like the
Yeah, I mean, there's this sense also in which there's a whole range of sort of viewing practices that's incorporated into how the work is meant to be seen. I mean, from this kind of very instrumentalized sort of batching or cutting of sort of slices of information that the indexes kind of figure, and a kind of connoisseurial training of the eye too, right? So there's this kind of, I mean, there's a certain blur or a certain uncertainty between what constitutes a kind of sort of highly strategic vision developed in the context of a very tight information economy, and a kind of a return of a certain kind of connoisseurial eye.
I mean, also, even staging these three, this is something we'll probably talk more about when we revise the paper after the opening at Bortolami and at Frieze, but staging these three simultaneous seasons that are all sort of the fifth season, the four seasons nested inside each other at the same time is a way of sort of deriving or even embedding information in sheer repetitiousness, which should be information nil in a way.
Redundancy. Yeah.
Redundant, yeah, is this sort of packing redundancy with information.
How old are you guys?
I am, I'm 16.
We are both 16.
I actually was not even born during most of the crisis we're talking about. I was gestating though. Just laughed.
Okay.
I think that
Sorry.
has to be the last question.
He left after that question.
We're lying. We're 14.
That's our combined age.
Any more questions? Can I just ask a question? I was wondering, in terms of the kind of temporality that you've kind of laid out in relation to the work in the biennial, how you see potentially that relating to a viewing experience of the biennial and the particular nature of the fourth floor of the biennial as a kind of performative space, or kind of,
Yeah.
creating a theatre performance, if you like.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that the turn to live performance in this sort of accelerated schedule of live performances is very much an attempt to retrofit the biennial into this kind of faster mode that I've been describing. And I think that the turn to performance in general maybe is in some ways correlated to that, but I think in this case very much so. Yeah.
Okay, well, maybe we should draw it to a close and have a drink afterwards, and people can ask Michael and Jeff questions
Just
more informally.
Not about our age, though. We've
Yeah.
already answered that one.
No more age-related questions. Thank you very much, Michael and Jeff.
Thanks. Thank you.